Good evening. I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to the third of our 2021 winter lectures, and thank you so much for joining us. If you should have any issues with connection this evening, please refer to your reminder email from Zoom, as it has contact information for Molly Silliman, our librarian, who's offering technical support tonight. And if you haven't done this already, would you please enter your name and where you live in the chat box? This is an exciting time for the Society, as we have just added a new Vice President of Development to our staff. I'd like him to say hello to everyone tonight, so please welcome Scott Stevens. Scott?
Hello, everyone. It's good to meet all of you virtually. As Faye mentioned, my name is Scott Stevens, and I'm the Vice President of Development at the South Carolina Historical Society. I've always loved South Carolina history, and I can't think of a better organization to be affiliated with. I've had the opportunity to spend the last couple of days touring the museum and the archives, and they are truly amazing. And then if you love South Carolina history like I do, and you're not a member of the South Carolina Historical Society, I encourage you to go to our website at schhistory.org and join today. I appreciate this opportunity to meet you this way, and I look forward to seeing you in the coming months.
Thank you, Scott. Now I want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Hayden R. Smith has conducted historical and archaeological research on former rice plantations for over 20 years. He's the author of Carolina's Golden Fields, Inland Rice Cultivation in the South Carolina Lowcountry, 1670 to 1860, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. He has also written several articles that examine the intersection of environment, technology, and culture. Awarded a Ph.D. from the University of Georgia in 2012, Dr. Smith teaches in the Department of History at the College of Charleston, with a focus on the South Carolina Lowcountry and the broader American South. We're very excited to welcome you, Dr. Smith. We're glad you're with us, and at this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate all of the Society members for joining us this evening. This evening, I want to talk about my research in inland rice cultivation. This is a cultivation that took place primarily in the colonial period, and many people believe that it fell apart or disappeared with the advent of tidal rice cultivation, and especially after the American Revolution. And I wanted to explain and debunk some of those myths today. So first, I wanted to define what inland rice cultivation was, what was the culture, and then second, explain its legacy in South Carolina history. So many of you are familiar with the sprawling tidal rice fields. This is the landscape that brought so much wealth to South Carolina, specifically in the antebellum period. Tidal rice came about by the middle of the 18th century, but it really took hold in the unique lowcountry environment after the American Revolution. But the type of rice cultivation that I'd like to discuss is more elusive. It exists more in overgrown woodlands. Perhaps if you've been hunting through the rural landscape or birding, walking through Francis Marion National Forest, you may have come across these berms, these embankments. These are remnants of the inland rice fields that existed for literally centuries. The term inland rice comes from its reference not only in where it was grown in reference to the coast, but also in reference to the tidal rice fields themselves. So here we have a plat of Limerick Plantation, which is off the east branch of the Cooper River. These are the tidal rice fields located along the east branch of the Cooper. But the inland fields are literally located inland of these uh, tidal floodplains. The basic inland rice system consisted of a impoundment that stopped a downward flowing body of water, turned it into a reserve, or what we'd call a reservoir today. The below the embankment are the actual rice fields. So water flows in one direction from upland down to lowland areas. The tidal rice fields, as many of you know, relies on the tidal hydrology of the ebb and flow of these rivers that brings water onto the fields where trunk minders would impound the water. It stays for a period of time, and then during a low tide, the trunk minder releases that water. Here, the water is impounded in a reservoir, and then when needed, released downstream until it's flooding the fields below it, and that those fields are impounded in a similar method. And then once again, that water is released as well. So like I said, this was a very simple method originally. It was easy for aspiring cultivators to place in many of these, what we call first or second order watersheds, more or less creeks or streams. Here we have Woodboo Plantation, which is now located underneath Lake Moultrie. And this was a stream fed, or I should say a spring fed creek from Big Spring that formed this reserve. And then the water flowed into Biggin Creek that was eventually modified into the Santee Canal. Another inland system was basically an extension of the tidal floodplains in more brackish waters. Here we have Drayton Hall, located in the middle left-hand side of this image. But to the right is almost like an arm, an extension. And this was one of the first areas where inland rice cultivation took place, located along the Ashley and the Cooper Rivers surrounding the Charleston Peninsula. Cultivators, planters would embank a fresh stream. In this case, it was located on the other side of the causeway from the road going into Drayton Hall. And then they would spend time in this circumstance to flush out the salts. It would take approximately 5 to 7 years, depending on how much water salinity was in the specific location. Researchers have identified 3 embankments in this particular form. One where the cursor is right now, a second midway down, and then there was a third that would have blocked the tidal undulations from coming from the Ashley River. So it shows a slight modification in how people controlled water. There's actually 3 divisions of rice fields that took place. Unfortunately, we do not know exactly when these rice fields were put in place. It was identified before the Drayton family actually moved to this location, before the Drayton Hall structure was actually built, but it's a representation of just an early or primitive form of these rice fields. Over time, inland rice fields become modified. Planters, along with slaves' help, begin to advance water control or water hydrology. Next to the Limerick Plantation on the east branch of the Cooper, headwaters known as Turkey Creek, which is now in Francis Marion National Forest, we have almost a crescent-shaped movement of water and related rice fields. The reservoir would be located in the upper right-hand corner, and then we see fairly large divisions of rice fields, 100 acres, 70 acres, 55 acres, 45 acres, that were put in place. And the enslaved would embank these rice fields as a way of controlling water flow. The inland fields were susceptible to a flooding, a downward flooding of water known as a freshet. And so having embankments, people could control the downward flow of water more efficiently and control the acreage more efficiently, how much acreage planters actually wanted to cultivate at a particular time. And this is one of the frustrating aspects of cultivating in this method in reflection to the tidal rice fields. Inland rice planters were totally dependent on the amount of water available in their reserves. If there was a drought, there obviously would have been little water available, especially in flooding large amounts of acreage, like 100 acres or 70 acres. Other years, when there was a lot of rain, like the Lowcountry is having this week, there would have been freshets that would have been these massive torrents of water flowing down through these field systems, providing too much water. So over time, planters began to develop wasteway canals, some would call them, or flanking canals. This was a canal system that you can see going around field letter B that allowed water to hit the embankment and then work its way around the left-hand side of this rice field. And then it would eventually flow into the natural course of Turkey Creek. So if there was a floodwater that came through this area, the trunk minders could possibly prevent it from breaching this upper field and then allowing it or rechanneling the water around the rice field. Now, one thing that's interesting about this particular plat is how these rice fields are reflective of the natural environment. The white area that you see in the middle is a highland area. It's a knoll that exists along these headwaters. So the rice fields more or less just took the natural shape of the topography. Whereas with the tidal rice fields, planters had the luxury of pushing the field systems further and further away from the actual rivers, as far towards the upland areas as the watersheds would allow. From here, we start to see how there are slight modifications in the field systems. In this inland system, it's a Charliewood plantation. This plat was from 1788. And at the time, it was held under Rutledge and Pinckney. They were in a joint business together, securing profitable plantations. And this was, as I said, along the headwaters of the Wando River. And it shows a reflection of a variety of different field systems. But the original rice fields were of a primitive sort, which is this image on the left. Uh, it was put in place by Richard Beresford Sr. By 1711. There are approximately 7 divisions that have a total of 75 acres that wrap around what is seen as this upland area. The lines here are basically grazing grounds for cattle, not to be confused for dikes or other embankments that were used for rice. And you can see in this uh, imagery how the field system wraps around the natural environment, forming almost a circle. The reservoir would have been located to the north. Water would have flowed down this field where it was split, primarily going to our right and then down towards the headwaters of the Wando. So a system that was consistent with the other 2 models that I showed, where it was just embankments holding back water. And anytime the water had to flow from one division to the next, it had to go completely through the field until the entrepreneurs came up with these flanking canals. But approximately by the mid 18th century, we start to see dramatic modifications to inland systems. They start to take more of a grid-like pattern that you see in the upper half of this plat. The original rice fields are located down at the bottom of this image. That's that circular shape with a settlement of enslaved row houses located next to it. But in the upper half, we see a system that is more consistent with the tidal rice planting, that it forms geometric shapes like squares or rectangles. And these fall in line with using water that flows through the canal systems, whether they are smaller canals or drains, ditches, anything to facilitate the water on and off the rice fields, and then linking in to more broader canals. This was a 20-foot wide canal that stretched from the neighboring plantation known as Fairlawn Plantation. And it was a navigable canal that then went to the headwaters of the Wando. This was known as Go Creek. The reserves used to channel this water to fill this acreage were massive. So instead of having roughly let's say a 25 or 50 acre reservoir or 50-acre reserve, they turned into hundreds of acres. At Charliewood, there was 3 reservoirs that were used to harness this water. And then the planters also relied on a number of tributaries, springs, and bays, basically wetland areas, to even carry more water into these larger field networks. So this is, one of the fascinating points of my research is that the traditional narrative is that inland systems started to fade away with the advent of the newer tidal rice technology as it started to appear in the mid 18th century. And then after the American Revolution, the traditional narrative is that the inland systems disappeared, whereas more planners were putting their capital in the tidal systems. But what happens is that there's actually a population of people that continued these inland systems and either modified their environment to reflect the newer technology of these grid-like field patterns, that if they had enough land and enough water to supply these newer fields, they were relatively successful in doing so. We also see a second class of planners that held on to the older inland rice fields as a way of securing some sort of economy from growing rice, even if it wasn't the latest and greatest in rice cultivation. So going back to this plat of Limerick Plantation, we can see how there are two different field systems that are going on here. The lower, as I pointed out, was the tidal system. The upper was an inland system. And this was known as a mixed regime. So planners who could afford to do so would not only focus their enslaved labor in cultivating rice along the tidal rivers, but they would also maximize their output by using the older inland systems if they were available. And it's interesting seeing this relationship between the two cultivation methods, because in some circumstances, they were two separate ways of growing rice. As I mentioned, with the inland system, it was just this downward flow of water from the reservoirs through the rice fields into the lower watershed, whereas the tidal the tidal fields relied on the ebb and flow of water coming from either tidal-induced creeks or rivers. But at the same time, the water used from the inland systems could also be used in the tidal fields if there was, let's say, a drought, which would have promoted more brackish water, the salts from flooding into the tidal fields. And this was just one more strategy of getting more fresh water into those rice fields. So salt water wouldn't destroy the crop. So these rice systems are just reflections not only of the environment, how the inland fields are nestled in these smaller watersheds, these first and second stream watersheds, as I mentioned, but they also work with the newer emerging technology. Enslaved life navigated between the two field systems. The settlements were located in the various upland areas. Sometimes settlements were located on the periphery, in these outward areas that much of the scholarship has focused on in rice culture. But with the inland fields, it brings in new questions of this historical legacy. You know, how do we value these inland field systems? Most of the tidal systems are protected either in a land trust or through, let's say, federal or state management. But inland systems has a different legacy, and not as many people are aware of these inland networks, and so they are more susceptible to not only falling by the wayside through just the natural forces of forests growing in these abandoned fields, but also through development and drainage. So with the rise of more development going on in these networks, specifically in the Lowcountry, it will challenge people to make the decision whether to overlook the remnants of these embankments and the amount of labor that went into these field systems, or to recognize them as historic landmarks of years past. So with that, I'll conclude the lecture. I want to thank you all, and I believe Dr. Jensen will field questions that I'll be happy to ask.
Thank you so much. I neglected to tell you all that we would have questions at the end of the talk. So if you want to write any questions in the chat, I will be reading them out. Let me see where we are. This was one. Were most of the inland rice fields easily accessible to a waterway in order to get the product to Charleston?
That is it. That is an excellent question. For the most part, no. And this was one of the reasons why inland fields weren't as popular as for a cultivation method compared to the tidal system. The only opportunities that inland planters had of getting their crop to the market from the rice fields themselves were from those canals that were built. So the planters in Biggin Basin, for instance, that surrounded the Santee Canal could take their crops to market through that canal system, or through the Fairlawn Canal at the headwaters of the Wando. There was also an extensive canal system in these fields here in the Rentals Creek Basin, just west of Highway 61 that feeds into the Stono River. So, you know, if you're talking about the efficiency of getting the crop to market, the inland system was not as efficient in transporting the crop through the Sooners and so forth. They would have to transfer it overland to at least a neighboring plantation that was located along the tidal rivers, or transport it to a public dock of sorts. So this was one of the disadvantages of the inland system based off of its geography.
Okay. Another question is, did the inland rice fields, were they first and then replaced by tidal rice fields?
Yes, yes. The inland fields were the first system of growing rice on a large scale. Planters experimented with just the upland method of casting broad seed, using traditional English methods of planting rice consistent with planting other grains. But the inland system, although we do not know the exact date, started to appear by the mid 1690s, 1695 or so. And it took off from there, beginning in the early 18th century, and was the only large-scale form of growing rice until approximately, let's say, 1746, 1748, when we start to see the rise of the tidal rice system. And then the two worked in tandem up until the Revolutionary War. And then afterwards, more planters, or planters with more capital, started to invest more in tidal rice, although the inland rice systems continued more or less up until the eve of the Civil War.
Okay, You answered several questions with that one. Now this one, someone wants to know the process to grow rice, and I'm thinking, okay, in 30 seconds or less.
Yes. So there are either 3 or 4 floodings for rice. It starts in late April, early May, and will continue until roughly mid to late August. And each flooding would last anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, followed by a period where the fields were left to dry out, if you say, for approximately 1 to 2 weeks, followed by a following flood. So it starts with the enslaved putting small stalks of rice into the rice fields, either from a nursery or just planting the seeds directly into the soil. Then it's flooded. The seeds start to sprout. The floodwaters are released. The rice will grow for a couple weeks. Then a second flood will take place, and then the water is released again. The soil will dry out. And then for inland rice fields, there's usually just a third flooding because the rice planters did not have as much consistent water supply from their reserves compared to the tidal planters. For those fortunate few, like at Charliewood or neighboring Fairlawn, they usually did have a fourth flood and consistent scheduling with the tidal rice fields. And then from there, the rice at the end of the season was cut down. It was taken to highland areas where the stalks would dry for a little bit of time, and then taken to a mill where it was processed. And Richard Porcher wrote an excellent book on that with the market preparation of rice.
He did. Okay, and then the question is, what varieties of rice were grown in these fields?
That's a very good question. The most popular variety was called Carolina Gold. And Carolina Gold was first grown on an inland rice field after the American Revolution, the Upper Santee, Hezekiah Mayum's plantation, although it was more popular on the tidal rice fields. But before the American Revolution, we do not know exactly what strains of rice were actually grown. We just know there are just general varieties, whether it was white rice, bearded rice, red rice, these general descriptions. And so that's where one of the frontiers of rice research lay in uncovering the DNA of these early rice strains that existed in South Carolina before the American Revolution. So to be continued.
Right, that's a fascinating subject. Another question, have you found evidence that indicates a difference in labor between inland and tidal fields? They're saying they suspect inland fields took somewhat less labor, but perhaps not dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Another good question. Inland still relied on the task system where people were assigned a specific task and they had to complete that task before they stopped work for the day. In contrast to the gang system that was more popular in upland cotton and tobacco plantations. The labor was just as difficult in clearing forest, reshaping the environment, to build embankments and ditches and get the fields to be almost level as they can be, while still allowing adequate water flow. And then obviously the um, growing and harvesting and preparation of the rice. Where there is a difference is in what you call the economies of scale. The tidal fields were much larger, whereas a inland rice field could be roughly 50 to, let's say, 250 acres. It's very rare that they exceeded 250 to 300 acres. Whereas with tidal fields, they were hundreds upon hundreds of acres. An average field being anywhere from 2 to 400 acres, and then they could go up to Jahazi Island that had close to 1,000 acres. So that's where the difference is in labor, that there was just a larger acreage to maintain and control and cultivate in a tidal system in comparison with the inland system.
Interesting. Another question is, how long would it take to construct the rice fields? How long till a planter would realize a profit?
Yes, it would take years, depending on the size of the rice fields. But as I mentioned, to clear cut the wetland areas, basically burn off all the stumps, remove all the vegetation and root systems, then build the canals, embankments, the dams to hold back the water. It would take years, and that's where planners and people associated with rice cultivation had to be very systematic in what was a ideal location for rice. And one could argue that one of the reasons why inland rice fields were abandoned, let's say, to a higher degree, is that the knowledge of picking out the right location wasn't as fine-tuned as, let's say, a tidal field system. There was more trial and error in trying to pick out these early systems. For example, the Draytons did not continue to grow rice on that extension, that arm of the Ashley River. Just wasn't profitable in comparison with the other rice fields that they owned in outlying plantations.
Interesting. Another person asked, what years were the heyday of rice production, and was it ever the leading agricultural crop of South Carolina?
So the heyday is, broadly speaking, it started at 1700 or 1698, if you want to split hairs, and lasted up until the Civil War, and even continued until the 1920s. And James Tootin argues up until World War II, even at some locations. But you could say that the heyday would have been in the antebellum period, and rice was the primary cash crop during the colonial period, and continued to generate excessive revenue in the antebellum period, along with Sea Island and upland cotton as well.
Right.
Or indigo, always playing second fiddle.
Another person asked, in your research, did you find out anything about the Indentured Irish being involved in rice culture?
The Irish were hired out from time to time. It's very rare, but from time to time to rebuild embankments and ditches. And it was often associated with smaller planters who could not afford to lose any of their enslaved labor to the tasks of what we call ditching. of maintaining those field networks, the waterways that controlled water flow. And you see it from time to time, and it started to take place primarily around the 1820s, when you see an increase of Irish immigration coming to the United States. But it wasn't prominent, just occasionally.
Okay. And then a question, if tidal rice fields were flooded with brackish water, didn't that harm the rice?
Yes, if tidal rice fields were flooded with brackish water, it would be an unfortunate event, and somebody would pay. Rice, or the variety of rice that was grown, the strain of rice that was grown in the Lowcountry was not salt tolerant. There are varieties that exist throughout the world that are salt tolerant, but the varieties that were grown in this area were not. And so if there was even brackish water that came in to the field networks, it would kill the crop.
Along the same line, someone said if no inland water supply was available, would they just cease production?
They would. This is where the trunk minder is basically the person who is assigned to opening and closing the trunk, or the gate that allowed water to come in and out of the rice field. They were often considered the most valuable person in the rice field because they knew when to shut the gate, or they were usually promoted to this highly sought after position, if you want to call it that, because they could judge when water was fresh or brackish. And by making that judgment, they could order these gates closed and prevent any brackish water from coming into the rice fields themselves. And if there was just a bad year, a series of droughts that enabled what was called a salt wedge, basically the push of the salt water from the ocean up the tidal river. If that came into a planter's fields, they would, if they already had their rice going, they would just keep the gates closed and hope for the best, and hope that their crop would survive off of rainwater and whatever water was already in the fields, or they could possibly just not cultivate at all. And that's where this mixed regime comes in, where planters would use a variety of different water methods, water resources, to bring water from these inland areas down to their tidal rice fields in case that extreme natural disaster happened.
Interesting. Another question is, what were the sources of rice cultivation technology and cultural knowledge, and how were these adapted to special conditions of the South Carolina?
So primary sources, is that, or hard to say?
Sources of rice cultivation technology. I guess they mean where it came from originally.
Right. That it's another hotly debated question, but to the best of my knowledge, this type of technology came from West Africa, that Africans used an inland system for centuries before even the Portuguese started to interact with the different cultures along the West African coastline. There was some discussion that inland systems also involved the English fen system of draining water, but the fen system is all about releasing water out of a field, preventing preventing it from coming into a field. So let's say cattle could graze in that field network. Whereas this system is about bringing water onto a field, retaining that water for a period of time, and then releasing it. And it may sound like a simple variation, but it's two different motives, or there's two different agendas. So it is interesting, and it helps support this black rice thesis that Judith Carney and Dan Littlefield and others have supported, is that this inland system, it was closely tied to an irrigation system that was already in place well before the New World was colonized.
Right. Thank you. You're holding up well. We have a lot of questions.
Oh, good. I like questions.
Okay. Another person asked, was soil exhaustion a bigger factor in the inland versus the tidal system?
I'll have to say that the members are asked the most educated questions I've ever encountered. Yes, the answer is yes. That soil exhaustion did take place more rapidly in an inland system compared to a tidal system. So whereas tidal fields would have alluvium, or they would naturally fertilize the rice fields as alluvium or sediment would come through the trunks from the flow of water onto the rice fields. The inland rice fields did not have that luxury. So soil exhaustion did take place in inland systems more frequently than the tidal rice fields. And you could say that some inland planters that still were planting by, let's say, the 1840s might have started to experiment with mixed husbandry and a lot of the scientific agriculture that was taking place, and using marl and other forms of fertilization. But most of those efforts were put into the cotton agricultural systems.
Okay. And this person wants to know if there were both inland and tidal rice fields at what is now Brook Green Gardens. She said there are many berms there.
I have not looked into Brook Green Gardens, so I cannot answer that question honestly. But at least in that general area, you just based off of the topography, you did not see as many inland rice field networks that took place in the general area that Brook Green is located in. Now, if you went a little bit further down the coast to like Hobcaw Barony, there was massive inland rice fields outside of Georgetown and in that general area. But just a little bit further up, they just didn't exist as much.
Made a difference, huh? This person asked, were there any inland systems large enough to have their own mills?
Yes. Matter of fact, the plat that I showed of Charliewood Plantation, they had their own mill at that location. I guess Limerick had a mill located on their site, although it gets a little complicated because they also had a tidal rice system. But mills did exist on the larger inland fields. And once again, it all has to do with the amount of impounded water. If planters had enough water to power a mill, they would do it.
Okay. And another, how far to the west did inland rice fields exist in the Lowcountry? And is there any evidence of the same enslaved plantation labor force cultivating both inland rice and cotton?
So that's an excellent question. The inland rice on a large scale network on a plantation system existed as far west as Columbia as the fall line. There's a large plantation called Goodwill, which I believe now is under state management. I don't know if it's actually a park yet or not, but if not, it will be soon. That was a Hugie family plantation that had, I think, approximately 300 acres of inland rice fields. The Orangeburg area had extensive inland rice fields, along with the area around Florence. Rice was grown as far north as surprisingly Greenville County, the upstate, but it was a different form of rice. It was, you could say, a hardier variety, and it was used primarily as a supplementary food or a supplementary crop, like a subsistence crop. So you didn't see as much intensive rice culture in the higher Midlands area in the upstate. But as far as plantation networks were concerned, or large scale rice cultivation, it did exist up to Columbia. That's an excellent question about a mixed use system of cotton and rice. I'm sure it existed. I just have not seen it in the written record, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did exist.
I had no idea it went so far west. That's
Yes,
fascinating.
yes.
Another question is, what were the primary markets for South Carolina rice?
And initially, South Carolina rice was first a domestic market and then shipped to the Caribbean. And then eventually rice started to go to European markets and the British Isles as well. The New England states imported rice. There's some research of this Charleston to Cape network of commerce that existed more or less between Boston and Charleston, and rice was a central component of that as well. So it started out, relatively small, going to, other plantation economies like Barbados and Bermuda, and then expanded further and further towards European markets by the antebellum period.
And this question is sort of related to the one about cotton. Did inland rice planters also grow other crops such as indigo?
They did. So they grew indigo, and they, let's see, they experimented with mulberry trees for silk production in the early stages. Let's see, they did tar and pitch by cutting down the pine trees, harvesting live oak for timber. So there was some mixed use. There's the common commodities of peas and corn that were always grown for, and then with the rise of truck farming and cattle ranching as well, they all supplemented in inland rice economy. But for the most part, the central focus was rice, whether it was tidal or or inland as well, with possibly some use of or growing of indigo while the bounty existed.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that is all the time we have for questions. There are a lot more questions left, so that's good. Everybody can read Dr. Hayden Smith's book, and we certainly appreciate you being with us tonight, Dr. Smith. I also am grateful for everyone who joined in attendance. I hope you'll join us next week for a talk on South Carolinians who relocated back to London. And that one will be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but if you can't make it, we'll be able to let you watch a YouTube of that later. You'll also be able to access the recording of tonight's talk. You'll get an email concerning that. But thank you again, Dr. Smith. Thanks to everyone who joined, and everybody have a good evening. Good night.